good evening and welcome to everyone that's joining us for tonight's episode of Hot Topics. If you have been following us over the last couple of weeks, we've been zooming in on COVID and what it means for us as Christians to respond ethically. But today we're actually going to be focusing on the church's ethical response as an organization. And what I've started to pick up else, one, on the episode we're going to be reviewing today, but also from the last couple of episodes, is what we understand of the pandemic, and that is what we understand of the vaccine, the pandemic, and what it means, has a lot of influence on our ethical response as an organization.
Absolutely. So this week's episode, what we're looking at is we had a conversation with Reverend Zwandile Molo. We had an opportunity to speak to psychologist Anela Siswana and also Bishop Joshua Mapunga. And in this episode, we looked at, like Loni's introduced, the church's ethical response. We not only looked at how does the church as an institution respond, but as the church, we as the church, how do we respond as individuals that make up the church? So as we kick off this conversation, the first thing that we asked was, do we believe that the church is correctly placed under large gatherings under the current COVID-19 restrictions as they have been as part of this pandemic by our government? We looked at this question: is it ethical for churches to be opened? Is it ethical for churches to remain closed? And what is the ideal ethical response as the church and as individuals that make up the church? The SACC is represented by Reverend Mandile Molo, and he speaks about their position on the current restrictions, but also the current stance of the church and the churches that make up the SACC as a response to a pastoral response to the pandemic, especially, and not just the opening and the closing of churches. And so let's have a look at this conversation now.
Good morning to everyone that is joining us today. And as Bishop Maponga has said, we've got Fundisi Molo, Reverend Molo, who is from the South African Council of Churches, and Anela Siswane. And together today, we're going to be exploring what it means for the church to respond ethically to the ongoing pandemic. For many of you guys at home, you might be thinking that we are almost there, it is almost over. But as some of us might have heard, that this is not the last pandemic we're most likely to have. We are in that age, and therefore it is important that we chew and understand what it means for the church to respond ethically during times like this. And so later on, we'll be joined by someone who will help us also explore, and the other side of the conversation we'll be exploring today as we speak about the closing of churches and whether it is the way that we are called to respond ethically. And so Umfundisi Molo will be guiding us on that. Good day, Tatu Molo, welcome.
Good day, Litonolo, and good day to everybody listening.
And so, Tata, this is where we want to start with everyone that is here today. Is the first thing is we understand that some people are of the notion that large gatherings, or rather religious gatherings, should not be easily categorized under large gatherings. That when we speak about large gatherings, we should have an exception to religious gatherings and perhaps not necessarily just place a uniform ban on all gatherings and make an exception for religious gatherings. So to shoot us off today, I just thought, can I hear what your heart is around this? Because I would imagine that this is where people are still stuck in this particular conversation.
You're referring to me?
Yes, please, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Indeed, the South African Council of Churches, in its own reflections on the matter of how to deal with the COVID pandemic, from the last year, we've spent a lot of time to a process which we call See, Judge, Act. And that process implies for us the need to do observation, which is trying to understand for ourselves, what is this thing? How does this thing operate? And how does it impact on the lives of the people? And out of that, you then develop a theological response that allows you then to engage with it as best as you can. And thirdly, design actions that are going to help you as those who are part of the SACC respond as comprehensive as you can. And what we have then done is we've developed what we call a pastoral response that we have shared with our member churches. And that one is one that is available in our website. From there, we developed what we had to deal with what is protocols that we as member churches of the SACC are going to employ in our response to what it might mean to gather as a congregation and as a people. And those recommendations were presented to government when we were still on lockdown level 4. And we made those recommendations for protocols and things that we will do, arguing to government that it should be possible for people to gather. And when people gather, these are the things that we can do as those who are in the SACC, who are able then to say, if you're going to gather, here are the protocols that we are going to follow. And those protocols have been popularized with our people, and some of them have engaged with them. And therefore, we moved from the basis that said it should be possible for people to gather, and when they gather, here are the protocols that we want to observe. So we have never had the stance that simply have a blanket thing that says people shouldn't be gathering. What we then did is to listen to what government is doing, and the notion that the SACC instruct government to do this or do that is not true. Secondly, the SACC speaks for those who are member churches of the SACC. It doesn't speak for every Christian. It doesn't speak for every gathering of those who are of faith orientation. It speaks for those who are members of the SACC. And when then the government then banned might not be a correct word, but when the gatherings were prohibited, the SACC was not consulted to say, what do you think, we want to close, to say yes or no. Like everybody else, we received the news as we have heard them. And therefore, we sought to understand what is it that informs that decision. And we're engaging with that even as we speak now, trying to engage government so that government is aware of the needs of the church and how the church can be allowed to operate, not only in terms of worship, but to be a place of renewed thinking, renewed engagement, and reimagination of what it is to be a community who's live under this pandemic. And that is the general stance of the SACC.
Now, that was an interesting input from Reverend Mzwandile Molo. And what stands out for me, Els, is how he then goes on to explain that the SACC it was never at any point against the gathering of churches. And which I suppose is such an important point for most of us to hear, because a lot of us have been divided around this particular point, and that is, should churches gather or not? I've heard some interesting views. For instance, I've heard people say, why aren't churches gathering? Should they not be trusting God's power to protect them against the spreading, the ongoing virus?
I've heard a lot of people also say, we are so much further progressed in the pandemic now. It's not like it's new restrictions. It's stuff that we've been living with for a while. Surely as a church, we know the restrictions, we know how to implement them. We might have found a way to access resources that we formerly couldn't to make it possible. So why is the church still closed? But then there's also other aspects like the ceremonial and sacramental aspects, which really makes it possible for churches rather to respond to stay closed or to gather online. You know, when we say closed, we mean the physical church building closed, not necessarily the church is shut. There's no interaction or pastoral response. There are realistically some stuff around the administration of communion and sacraments, or the ceremonial stuff like the ashes on Ash Wednesday, where we could find ourselves in a bit of a tricky spot if we do not adhere to restrictions.
But I think as Mzwandile Molo will go on to explain as we watch on, as we speaks about that our priority as the church is not necessarily to just follow government regulations, but what is important to us as a faith community is to preserve life, to protect life, and to ensure that people have life in abundance. That's our business. We are in the business of life. And so whatever decision we come to as a faith community has to prioritize life and nothing else above lives. So for instance, if me applying ashes on you would compromise your life, then it's a bit problematic for me to do that. However, if I can do it in a way that protects you, then great.
Exactly. I think what he's about to highlight in the conversation is about the pastoral response. Whatever our stance is, how do we journey with people in the best way that protects their life, their livelihood, and that loves each other as we've been mandated by Jesus to do. So as the church, whatever we decide to do, how do we respond? And that's what he speaks about with the SACC's response. So let's have a look now at what Reverend Molo had to say about this.
And then I would imagine, other arguments that we've had come out from people who would prefer that churches gather. And I'm asking this because I would love to hear your thoughts around it. I would imagine that these are things that you've considered. They argue that, one, you look at in Iran, where because of a religious leader that then invited people into the worship space to say, come to a space of healing. That resulted in one of the major outbreaks in Iran. You look at a similar situation in Malaysia, Pakistan, and in India, where you had religious scholars who were gathered, and which resulted in an outbreak, particularly also in India. That some would then argue that, but that was at the beginning of the pandemic, before churches knew how to manage the virus. And we think that churches are more capable than they were at the beginning of the pandemic. Another example they would make of are issues such as the one we had in Free State, where there was a gathering right at the beginning of the pandemic, and it resulted in several people being infected with the virus. But then whenever you raise these gatherings as an example of why it might not be the best idea for churches to gather under the circumstances, the argument that is then raised is churches were not capable, did not have the knowledge on how to manage the situation then. They are, however, in a different situation as we speak. How do we then process that? How do we then continue to say, perhaps let's not gather in light of that argument?
I repeat, Lieutenant, as I indicated earlier on, the South African Council of Churches, I think around about August last year, if I remember well, the dates might escape me. In the anticipation of the need for us to live with the reality of the pandemic is not going to disappear tomorrow. The pandemic is not going to disappear even in the midst of the vaccine. The pandemic is not going to disappear. The SACC anticipated that. And because we anticipated that, we did our own due diligence in terms of engaging scientists who will inform us about how this virus operates, who will tell us how it engages and spreads in life. And out of that journey, we developed what we call protocols that we, for ourselves, we said, if you are going to be a church that is going to be opening and living with this, these are the protocols that we want to put in place, because we believe the church is a place of life. The church is not a place where death should be spread, but it's a place where life should be enhanced. And because we believe that, we then invested our own thinking about what does it mean. And we had a comprehensive document that moved from talking about, because the SACC has got diverse membership. It's got people who are in the Zionist movement, in the sense of worship tradition. It's got people who are in the Pentecostal movement. It's got people who are in the what we call now mission churches, other calling it is the colonizing churches. All of those churches are part of the SACC. So we developed a protocol that took into account what does it mean to have Holy Communion? What does it mean to worship? What does it mean to worship when you're worshiping in a mat, as you might be? So all those things were pulled together. And when they are pulled together, firstly, they were presented to government and say to government, these are the commitments we want to make to the church. And those commitments sometimes even go beyond what government expects of us. Because for the SACC, we owe our loyalty to life, not because government tells us to preserve life. We owe our loyalty to a God who says, I've come so that they must have life and have life in abundance. So our own standards are beyond what government might be asking or wanting, because our commitment is to a God of life, who creates life, who sustains life, who protects life, and that's what we do. So in dealing with that very same question, last year, as I say, around August, the SACC developed protocols that said people can gather, here are the protocols, a way of how it is to protect life. It has got people, how when do you attend church, how do you organize that? It has got how do you consult your doctors. All those things are part of what we have put before the government, before our member churches to respond to the need. We do say to government, please government, don't understand church as only as worship. Church life is bigger than simply worship. It is about counseling. It is about taking care of people in many different ways. So we need to find a way to make sure that our people are able to do ministrations that are going to give life to our people.
So one of the things that stand out for me in Mzwandile Molo's response, is one, again, how he speaks about the importance of preserving life, but also he applies what we would call teleological ethics, and that is being more concerned about the outcome. So you go into a situation, you do not, you're not fixated on doing what is right or wrong, but your concern is rather what will bring about the best outcome. And so even in engaging this pandemic, our concern is what would bring about the best outcome. And the best outcome in our context is what would help us to best preserve lives.
Exactly. And I love the way that he speaks about that, because there's such a possible way in this pandemic to do all the right protocols, to follow the government regulations and still not to preserve life in that. There's a way of ticking the boxes and really not really caring about people's life or if it really helps them, but just ticking the box, just saying, I did what I was supposed to. And sometimes we even find ways to bend the rules around it because it suits our purposes. So I really love how he highlights that it's not that our stance as a church is just to tick the box of we follow the regulations, but as a church we go over the mandate of the government to follow restrictions so that we say we're doing whatever is best to preserve life.
In actual fact, also, one of the points that really sticks out for me, or rather one of the realities that comes with what you're speaking about, is the fact that how we respond as a church to the ongoing pandemic will inform how people respond to when engaging it on a daily basis.
Absolutely.
So for instance, if I'm leading a church that is just ticking boxes, then my congregation member is most likely to engage it in the same way. But if I am challenging people to go beyond, beneath the surface, and preserve life in all that they do, then even how they respond to the next person who is begging, who has been placed on a street corner because they've been retrenched, will speak into that. They won't just say, well, I've done my due diligence and that's it, but they will go a step further and make sure that they can preserve and help preserve life as much as they can.
The next interesting part of the conversation that we had was with psychologist Anele Siswana. So Anele highlights for us some of the things that we deal with as the church closed. For some people, the church has really been closed. There's no way of reaching the congregation because of access points being shut. For some, we've moved online, and the only way to reach one another is in the online space. How is this affecting our people, and how are we coping, especially with the pastoral response? How do we deal with people at funerals, those that are facing the loss of loved ones, those that are in need of care and counseling? How is this pandemic and the church's response so far impacting individuals?
Check out the scene where we speak to Anele. To come to you now, Mkhulu, and find out from your side. You have seen a lot of patients, you have seen a lot of people. What has been the impact for those of us who belong to religious spaces that have chosen to not gather in light of the pandemic, even when churches were allowed to gather later last year? In your experience, what has been the impact on the individual not being able to access these spaces of healing, these spaces of gathering, these spaces that are so meaningful to their life journey on a Sunday?
I think for me, what this pandemic has done is it has made us to think about fellowship in a different way. It has made us to think differently about spiritual disciplines. It has made us to think differently about all the other things that we always look at when we think about spiritual well-being. So for me, what the pandemic has done, as a psychologist, number one, I have seen how people, to a certain degree, they feel misaligned, that there's something that people are used and conditioned to go to this space, as in church, as a form of fellowship, as a form of belonging. Now, if you take, for instance, in black churches or black communities, imitandas, or when someone has died, it would be a practice that after the service we'll go and pray for that person or with that person. That form of psychosocial, spiritual support in that sense has been taken away. Now, people have experienced a range of problems, significant number of losses that we haven't had the chance to grieve for those people that our friends, our congregants, and everything, and everyone who's around us. So the people are deprived of exercising what it means to be human. People have lost the sense of what we deem as Ubuntu within the context of spirituality or in the context of theology. So that, for me, has led to another form of what I call spiritual depression. Because especially for those people who really believe that church serves as a center and display in a place that is a fountain of healing. Now, I can't get access to Mfundisi or my pastor because there are protocols. I can't be with my people that are around me, that I'm used to fellowship with. It adds another strain. So there's a degree and sense of isolation. Now, Bishop Maponga might not afford to come and see me because, for instance, I charge 1,300 to get a psychosocial support level from a psychologist. Now, I don't have that money. I don't have a minister. I don't have a community. So there's a sense of displacement. Another controversial thing that I've been thinking about, for me personally, subjectively, I have even wondered, as a Christian or someone that looks at the world from that world, do I need church for me to feel enlightened and connected with God? No. However, I understand why the government has had to go to that extreme, because we're going to have many problems, we're going to have many deaths and all of that. So, for me, as Umkulu, as you referred me earlier, I have never been so connected to my ancestors than I've ever been before. It's a different conversation because Umsamo is at home. I can go there at 3 a.m., 6 a.m., 9 a.m., or 3 p.m. and all of that. So I think beyond looking at the problem, Hloni, and you, Bishop, is that we need to think about what are some of the alternative ways of how we rethink fellowship. What are some of the ways in which we can think about how to connect with others without being a church physically? I mean, other churches have even gone far to virtual services. However, now I think people in also churches can think about how do we create spaces for pastoral care virtually. I may not be there to give this psychosocial support, but there's a virtual space for that. We might probably create spaces where ministers are available for at least for a certain number of time. At least 2 or 3 people a day are seen for pastoral care. But for me, psychologically, and as a psychologist, I'm sitting here, I have never seen a greatest number of people that I have seen since COVID.
So it was really interesting to hear what Anele had to say for me, especially around the idea of an enhanced or an improved relationship with God despite the church not being able to gather physically. I thought that was quite interesting. I don't know about you, Cloney.
Absolutely, man. For the longest of time, the church has been in conversation about moving from a church-centered, home-supported spirituality and moving rather towards a home-centered, church-supported spirituality. And in as much as the pandemic has forced AI to improve, to advance at a faster pace, it has also forced this conversation to advance, because that's basically what we've had to do as a church. We've almost become like this institution that supports home-centered spirituality because people can no longer come to church. And Anela also touches on that, and he says how much he's benefited from the flexibility and the freedom to have a home-centered spirituality and not always having to go to the church in order to nourish his spiritual relationship.
And that's completely true, but there's also the flip side of this where people have not been able to access the essential care that they need. So Anela speaks about not being able to reach a minister because the minister is not available to come to them or not able to come to them, not being able to reach psychologists because of stuff like access, like money, not being able to travel the distance or pay for the consulting fees that a psychologist would charge. How does this impact us? And so we have to acknowledge the pain and the difficulty of the churches being closed or only online.
But again, he then picks up on the conversation around how the pandemic forces the church to reinvent, to reimagine how it exists in society. For the longest of time, we have not been accessible to people who work till late. We always speak about issues of access when it comes to people who cannot afford, which is very important. But very often, we marginalize those who are participating in the economy. And because they cannot access our church services during the hours during which we operate, we are okay for life to go on. And for the first time, we have been forced to reimagine this. And I can imagine beyond the pandemic, we will have learned to be more accessible to people who work till 9 o'clock, till 10 o'clock, people who work night shifts and are sleeping during the day. We have learned and have been forced to reimagine ways in which we can be accessible to them. In actual fact, I heard a very nice quote over the last week, and they said for the first time, church is a click away.
Wow, that's beautiful. It's really a nice way of thinking about church. And I think what you highlight there about the church needing to reimagine and find itself still relevant in a post-COVID different world is going to be the challenge for us as a church. So next week we're going to be unpacking this topic a little bit more as we look at the reimagining of the church in a post-COVID world and also in a current COVID world. How do we reimagine as the church to reach people and to care for people as well? So please do join us next week for the last episode of our COVID-19 and the Christian series. We'll see you then.